Settle in. Let the day's noise fade behind you. We're going to travel together across a vast grassland, under an enormous sky, to a time when home was something you could carry with you. This is a story about the Tipi, not a tent, not a primitive shelter, but a sophisticated dwelling born from a landscape that demanded motion. It's a story about engineering and adaptation, about living in rhythm with animals that never stopped moving, and about finding warmth and comfort in a world of brutal extremes. There's no drama here, only the quiet unfolding of a way of life that made perfect sense in its place and time, so breathe slowly and let's begin. The Great Plains of North America were not a gentle place. This was a landscape that stretched from the Mississippi River in the east, all the way to the foothills of the Rocky Mountains in the west. From the grasslands of present-day Canada, it rolled southward through what would become the Dakotas, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, and down into Texas. It was an inland sea of grass, extending in every direction to the horizon. A person could walk for weeks and see nothing but grassland and sky. There were no great forests here, no dense woodlands to break the wind or provide easy timber for building. Trees grew only along the riverbanks, cottonwoods and willows clustering in the sheltered valleys where water ran year-round. Out on the open prairie there was grass, sky, and wind. The wind was constant. It moved across the plains like a current, bending the grasses in long rolling waves. In spring and summer, it carried the scent of wildflowers and fresh growth. In autumn, it brought the smell of dry earth and the first hints of cold. In winter, it cut through clothing and exposed skin with brutal efficiency. The winters on the Great Plains were long and severe. Temperatures could plunge far below freezing, and blizzards swept across the open country with nothing to slow them. Snow piled in drifts that buried entire landscapes. A person caught out in the open during a winter storm faced death within hours. Early travellers crossing the plains in winter wrote of the cold as something beyond their previous experience, a cold that seemed to reach through every layer of protection. Summer brought its own challenges. The heat could be intense, especially in the southern plains. The sun beat down on the grass without mercy, and there was little shade to be found. The air shimmered over the land in waves. Thunderstorms rolled across the prairie with dramatic force, bringing lightning, hail, and torrential rain. The storms could be violent, but they passed quickly, leaving the air clean and the grass glistening. Then the heat would return, drying everything out again within hours. The temperature could swing 40 degrees between day and night. This was a landscape where the weather was never mild for long, where extremes were the normal condition of existence. The distance itself was a challenge. The horizon stretched in all directions, offering no landmarks, no natural boundaries. Travellers described the disorienting effect of moving across the plains, where a day's journey might bring no visible change in the landscape. The grass rolled on, the sky remained vast, and the sense of scale pressed down on human consciousness. Rivers provided the only reliable markers, cutting through the grassland in winding courses, their cottonwood-lined banks visible from miles away. For the peoples who made the Great Plains their home, this environment shaped every aspect of life. The lack of forests meant that wood was a precious resource, not to be wasted on large, permanent structures. The climate demanded shelter that could keep a family warm in winter and cool in summer, and the vastness of the land, combined with the constant movement of the animals they depended on, meant that staying in one place was never an option. The landscape itself dictated the kind of home that could work here. It had to be portable, efficient, and tough enough to withstand the wind and weather. The tipi was the answer to all of these demands. The tipi is immediately recognizable by its shape, a tall, slender cone that rises from a circular base to a point at the top. This form was not chosen for aesthetic reasons, though it is undeniably elegant. Every aspect of the tipi's design was a response to the practical needs of life on the Great Plains. The cone shape was a solution to problems of wind, weather, and space. First, consider the wind. On the open prairie, the wind never truly stopped. It might calm to a gentle breeze in the morning, but by afternoon, it was often gusting with enough force to tear apart a poorly designed shelter. A rectangular structure, with flat walls and sharp corners, would catch the wind like a sail. The pressure would build against the walls, straining the framework and pushing the structure over. But a cone presents almost no surface for the wind to push against. The wind simply flows around the curved walls, sliding up and over the top. The shape deflects force rather than resisting it. The stronger the wind blew, the more tightly it pressed the hide cover against the supporting poles, actually making the structure more secure. The Tipi was not a perfect cone, however. It had a subtle asymmetry. The back of the Tipi, the side facing the prevailing westerly winds, was steeper than the front. This created a profile that looked almost egg-shaped when viewed from the side. The steeper back wall braced more effectively against the wind, while the gentler slope at the front provided a more comfortable interior space near the doorway. This tilt was deliberate, refined over generations of experience. The people who built teepees understood exactly how wind moved across the prairie, and they shaped their homes accordingly. The height of the cone also mattered. A tall structure created more interior volume without requiring a larger base. This was important because the teepee had to fit into the social and practical landscape of a camp. Teepees were arranged in circles or in formal clusters, and each family needed enough space around their dwelling for daily activities: tanning hides, drying meat, tending fires, watching children. A teepee that spreads too wide would encroach on neighbouring spaces. By building upward rather than outward, the design maximised living space while keeping the footprint manageable. Inside, the cone created a natural circulation of air. Warm air rises, and in a conical space it rises directly to the top. This simple fact of physics was exploited brilliantly in the teepee's ventilation system. At the apex of the cone, where all the poles converged, there was an opening. Smoke from the central fire could rise straight up and exit through this hole. The shape of the dwelling turned the basic behaviour of warm air into a functional chimney. No other shape would have worked as efficiently. The cone was also structurally sound. The weight of the hide cover was distributed evenly across all the supporting poles, and the poles leaned inward at angles that transferred the load down into the ground. There were no weak points, no single beam that bore too much weight. If one pole broke or shifted, the others held. The design was inherently stable, requiring no nails, no joinery, no complex carpentry. It was a framework held together by tension, gravity, and the leather thongs that lashed the poles at the top. Simplicity was strength. The walls of a teepee were not made of canvas or woven fabric. They were made of buffalo hide, and the process of preparing that hide transformed it into something remarkable. A material that was both opaque enough to provide privacy and thin enough to glow with filtered light. Buffalo hide in its raw state is thick, heavy, and stiff. It's covered with coarse hair on one side and layers of fat and tissue on the other. It smells strongly of the animal. Left untreated, it would rot within days. But the women of the plains tribes knew how to transform this raw material into something durable, flexible, and beautiful. The process began immediately after a buffalo was killed. The hide was carefully removed from the carcass, keeping it as intact as possible. Large hides from mature animals were prized for teepee covers, though it took many hides to make a single dwelling. The hide was then staked out flat on the ground, stretched tight with wooden pegs driven through small holes around its edges. This kept it from shrinking as it dried. While the hide was still fresh, women used specialised tools, large bone or stone scrapers with handles, to remove every bit of flesh, fat and membrane from the inner surface. This was hard, repetitive work, requiring strength and patience. The hide had to be scraped down to an even thickness, which meant working methodically across the entire surface, removing thin layers bit by bit. If the scraping was uneven, the hide would be weak in some areas and too thick in others. Once the flesh side was clean, the hair had to be removed. This was done either by scraping the outer surface or by treating the hide with a mixture that loosened the hair so it could be pulled away in clumps. The goal was to leave the hide bare on both sides, exposing the dense network of collagen fibres that gave it strength. The next step was crucial. The hide, now hairless and cleaned, was treated with a mixture made from the brains and liver of the buffalo, mixed with water into a thick paste. This mixture was worked into the hide, massaging it deep into the fibres. The fats and enzymes in the brain matter softened the collagen, making the hide supple rather than stiff. This process, called brain tanning, was ancient knowledge, passed from mothers to daughters across countless generations. After the hide had absorbed the treatment, it was rinsed, wrung out, and then stretched and worked again as it dried. Women would pull and flex the hide repeatedly, sometimes rubbing it over a smooth wooden beam or rope to break down the fibres further. This constant working kept the hide soft and pliable as it dried, preventing it from hardening into rawhide. The final step was often a light smoking. The hide was suspended over a low, smouldering fire of green wood or damp bark, which produced thick smoke but little flame. The smoke permeated the fibres, giving the hide a golden tan colour and making it more resistant to water. A smoked hide would remain soft, even if it got wet and then dried out again. An unsmoked hide would stiffen when wet. The result of all this labour was a material that was tough, lightweight, and remarkably thin. A well-prepared buffalo hide could be scraped down until it was translucent. When sunlight struck the walls of a tipi covered in such hides, the light didn't simply stop at the surface. It passed through, diffused and softened, filling the interior with a warm amber glow. The effect was gentle and calming. Even on the brightest summer day, the light inside a tipi was never harsh. It had the quality of late afternoon sun filtering through parchment. At night, firelight from within would make the tipi glow from the outside, a soft beacon in the darkness of the prairie. This translucency also provided practical benefits. The occupants could see shadows moving outside, which gave them awareness of who was approaching without needing to step out. And the diffused light meant that the interior was never fully dark during the day, even with the doorway closed. There was always enough light to work by, to see faces, to move comfortably within the space. When summer arrived on the Great Plains, the heat could become oppressive. The sun climbed high in a cloudless sky, and the air over the grasslands shimmered. There was little shade anywhere. A person standing in the open at midday felt the sun pressing down, the heat radiating up from the ground beneath their feet. The grass itself seemed to hold the warmth, releasing it slowly through the afternoon and evening. Inside a poorly ventilated shelter, the heat would have been suffocating, the air still and heavy. But the tipi, through a combination of design and adjustability, remained surprisingly comfortable. The key was airflow. The conical shape of the tipi naturally encouraged the movement of air. As the sun warmed the hide cover, the air inside the dwelling warmed as well, particularly near the top of the cone. Hot air is less dense than cool air, so it rises. In the tipi, this rising warm air moved directly toward the apex, where the smoke hole provided an exit. As the hot air flowed out through the top, it created a gentle suction, a continuous updraft that drew fresh air into the dwelling from below. To complete this circulation, the occupants would adjust the bottom edge of the tipi cover. The cover was not staked down permanently. It simply rested against the ground, held in place by its own weight and by smooth stones placed along the interior perimeter. On hot days, the stones were moved aside and the bottom edge of the cover was rolled up, sometimes as much as a foot or more. This created a gap all the way around the base of the tipi. Cool air, which naturally settled near the ground where the earth retained some of the night's coolness, could now flow inward through this gap. As it entered, it replaced the warm air that was exiting through the top. The result was a steady, gentle breeze that moved through the entire interior. This convection current was not dramatic. It was a soft, continuous movement of air, barely noticeable except for the relief it provided. A family sitting inside the tipi on a hot afternoon would feel the coolness rising from the ground, a faint stirring that kept the air from becoming stagnant. Children lying on buffalo robes near the walls might feel the breeze more noticeably, a coolness passing over their skin. The temperature inside was noticeably cooler than outside in the direct sun, often by several degrees. It was not refrigeration, but it was genuine comfort. The movement of air also carried sound. The wind passing through the gap at the base of the tipi created a low, steady whisper, almost musical in its constancy. This sound was familiar and soothing, a reminder that the dwelling was breathing, that it was alive in its own way. On particularly hot days, when even small movements felt like effort, families would arrange themselves near the walls where the incoming air was freshest, reclining on their backrests and working on quiet tasks, sewing, beadwork, tool repair, that required no exertion. The smoke flaps at the top of the tipi also played a role in managing airflow. These were two triangular extensions of the hide cover, each supported by a long external pole. By adjusting the position of these poles, the occupants could control the size and orientation of the smoke hole. On a calm day, the flaps could be opened wide, maximising the exit point for hot air. the opening might be as large as 3 feet across, a substantial vent that allowed heat to escape freely. If a breeze picked up, the flaps could be angled to catch the wind and create even stronger suction, pulling air through the dwelling more rapidly. If the wind shifted and threatened to blow down into the teepee, the flaps could be repositioned to shield the opening. The people who lived in these dwellings learned to read the wind instinctively, adjusting the flaps throughout the day without conscious thought, the way a sailor trims a sail. The translucency of the hide also helped during the summer. Sunlight passed through the walls, but the thick fibres of the hide absorbed and diffused much of the heat. The interior was bright but not baking. On the brightest days, when the sun was directly overhead, the entire teepee would glow with warm amber light. But the light came from all directions at once, filtered and softened, rather than as direct harsh rays. This diffused illumination was pleasant to the eyes, and created a sense of calm inside the dwelling. Even when the temperature outside was oppressive, the interior of the teepee maintained a quality of refuge. Because the hide was flexible, the walls could be adjusted in other ways. If a particular area of the teepee was receiving too much direct sun, if the western wall was becoming uncomfortably warm in the late afternoon, that section of the cover could be loosened slightly, creating a small gap that increased airflow. Some families would hang lighter cloths or additional hides inside the teepee to create shaded zones, blocking direct light while still allowing air to circulate. These adjustments were small and took only moments, but they made a noticeable difference in comfort. Even the orientation of the teepee helped. The doorway almost always faced east. This meant that in the morning, the rising sun would shine directly into the entrance, warming the interior and signalling the start of the day. But by afternoon, when the sun was at its hottest, it was on the opposite side of the dwelling. The back wall, which faced west, took the brunt of the afternoon heat, while the doorway in the front of the teepee remained in relative shade. This simple alignment made a noticeable difference. Families would often gather near the eastern side of the teepee during the hottest part of the afternoon, taking advantage of the shade there. The daily rhythm of adjustment became second nature. In the early morning, the teepee might still be sealed from the night, the bottom edges down, and the interior warm from the fire. As the sun rose and the day began to heat up, someone, often one of the women or older children, would roll up the bottom edge of the cover section by section, securing it with ties. By mid-morning, the dwelling would be fully opened, the breeze flowing freely. As the afternoon arrived and the heat peaked, the smoke flaps might be adjusted to maximize ventilation. In the evening, as the sun set and the temperature began to drop, the bottom edge of the cover would be lowered again, retaining some of the day's warmth for the cooler night ahead. This constant, gentle interaction with the dwelling kept the occupants attuned to the weather and the changing conditions throughout the day. They were not separated from the environment by walls that blocked all sensation. They lived within the climate, responding to it, working with it. The teepee made this possible not by isolating them from the heat, but by managing it, creating a space where the extremes were moderated and life could continue comfortably. At the very top of the teepee, where all the poles came together and the hide cover tapered to a point, there was an opening. This was the smoke hole, the exit for the smoke from the central fire. But the smoke hole was not simply a fixed gap in the cover. It was framed and controlled by 2 large triangular flaps, extensions of the hide cover that could be moved and adjusted from outside the dwelling. Each smoke flap was reinforced along its outer edge, with a wooden stick sewn into a pocket in the hide. This gave the flap structure and prevented it from flapping loosely in the wind. At the corner of each flap a long pole was attached. These poles, called smoke flap poles, extended down to the ground outside the teepee. By moving the base of these poles, the occupants could change the position and angle of the flaps, opening or closing the smoke hole, directing it away from the wind, or adjusting it to draw air more efficiently. The smoke flaps were essential for ventilation. In calm weather, the flaps could be spread wide, creating a large opening at the top of the teepee. This maximised the exit for warm air and smoke, allowing the interior to breathe freely. But the weather on the Great Plains was rarely calm for long. Wind was the constant companion of the life on the prairie, and managing the smoke hole in the wind required skill and attention. When the wind picked up, the smoke flaps had to be adjusted to prevent the wind from blowing down into the teepee. If the wind came from the west, the western smoke flap pole would be moved to angle that flap outward, creating a barrier that deflected the wind up and over the opening. The eastern flap would be adjusted to create a sheltered exit on the lee side. The configuration changed throughout the day as the wind shifted direction. The people who lived in the teepee learned to read the sky and the movement of the grass, anticipating changes in the wind and adjusting the flaps before the smoke began to pour back down into the dwelling. In a rainstorm, the flaps could be drawn nearly closed, leaving only a small gap for the smoke to escape. This prevented rain from pouring directly down onto the fire and the occupants below. The smoke would still find its way out, rising warm air is persistent, but the opening was small enough that very little water entered. In winter, when snow fell and temperatures dropped, the smoke flaps became even more critical. Snow could accumulate on the hide cover, adding weight and potentially blocking the smoke hole entirely. The flaps were adjusted frequently to shake off snow and to ensure that the opening remained clear. If the smoke hole became blocked, the interior would fill with smoke, making the dwelling uninhabitable within minutes. Keeping the smoke flaps properly managed was not a minor detail. It was essential to survival. The smoke flap poles also served a practical purpose beyond adjustment. They were landmarks. In a camp of many teepees, arranged in a circle or scattered along a riverbank, it could be difficult to distinguish one dwelling from another, especially at night or in poor weather. But each family managed their smoke flap poles in their own way, and the position of those poles, leaning at a particular angle crossed in a certain pattern, became a visual signature. A person returning to camp could find their home by the familiar stance of those two poles against the sky. As autumn deepened and the first hard frosts arrived, the nomadic peoples of the Great Plains began to think about winter. The great bison herds, which had been scattered across the open prairie during the summer, began to gather into larger groups, moving toward the sheltered river valleys where they would spend the cold months. The people followed, their movements synchronized with the animals that sustained them. Finding a good winter camp was not a casual decision. It required careful observation and collective judgment. The location had to offer several essential things: protection from the wind, access to water that would not freeze completely, a supply of firewood, and grass for the horses. The ideal location was a river valley with high bluffs or ridges to the north and west. These natural barriers would block the worst of the winter storms, which typically came from those directions. The wind, when it reached the valley floor, would be diminished, broken by the surrounding land. The valley floor itself, sheltered by the surrounding terrain, would be several degrees warmer than the exposed prairie above. These microclimates made the difference between harsh survival and relative comfort. Some valleys were known and returned year after year, their advantages proven through experience. Others were discovered through exploration, with scouts going out ahead of the main group to assess potential sites. Cottonwood and willow trees grew along these rivers, their presence visible from a distance as dark lines across the grassland. The trees provided a source of firewood. Though cottonwood was not ideal, it burned quickly and produced little lasting heat. Still, it was abundant and easy to gather. The willows, smaller and more flexible, could be used for making backrests, fish traps, and other tools. More importantly, the bark of cottonwoods could be stripped and fed to horses when the grass was buried under snow. Horses could survive on this bark, though they lost weight and strength through the winter. Managing the horses' food supply was a constant concern during the cold months. The valley also needed to have enough flat ground for the camp itself. Teepees required a level space, and a camp of 20 or 30 families needed a significant area. The ground needed to drain well. A low spot that collected water during snowmelt would become a muddy, miserable place. The camp would be positioned close enough to the river for easy access to water, but far enough back to avoid flooding if the ice broke up suddenly in spring. Once a suitable site was chosen, the camp was established with care. Teepees were arranged in a circle or a crescent depending on the terrain and the size of the group. The doorways, as always, faced east, but the teepees were also positioned to take advantage of any natural windbreaks, stands of trees, rock outcroppings, bends in the river that created sheltered pockets. Some families would position their teepees near the base of bluffs, gaining additional protection from the landform itself. The goal was to create a settlement that was as protected as possible from the elements, while still maintaining the social cohesion of the group. With the teepees erected, the work of winter preparation began in earnest. The most important task was to secure the base of each dwelling against drafts. On the open prairie in summer, A gap at the bottom of the teepee allowed cool air to flow in. In winter, that same gap would let in freezing wind and drain away all the warmth from the fire. To prevent this, earth was mounded up around the outside base of the teepee, forming a low berm that sealed the gap between the hide cover and the ground. This work required digging, and if the ground was already frozen, it was difficult labour. Axes or heavy stone tools were used to break through the frozen crust, and the loosened earth was piled and packed around the teepee's perimeter. In areas where the ground was frozen too hard to dig, snow was packed around the base instead, forming an insulating barrier. The snow was compressed and shaped, creating a seal that was nearly as effective as earth. This banking was rebuilt and maintained throughout the winter as wind and weather eroded it. Inside the teepee, a second layer of insulation was installed. This was the dew cloth, an inner lining that hung from the poles and extended from the ground up to a height of about 6 feet. The dew cloth was made from additional hides, or in later periods after contact with traders, from canvas obtained through trade. It was suspended so that it hung a few inches away from the outer cover, creating a pocket of trapped air between the two layers. This air pocket acted as insulation, much like the space between the panes of a modern double-glazed window. It slowed the transfer of heat from the interior to the cold outer surface. The installation of the dew cloth was done carefully, ensuring that it hung evenly and that its bottom edge rested firmly against the ground to prevent drafts from entering beneath it. Firewood was a major concern. A family would need a substantial supply to last through the winter months, and gathering it was continuous work. The men would go out with axes or stone tools, cutting dead branches and felling small trees. The wood was hauled back to camp on travois or carried in bundles. It was stacked near each teepee, creating reserves that could be drawn on during storms when leaving the dwelling was dangerous. The quality of the wood varied. Some cottonwood branches were green and would smoke excessively. Others were dry and burned cleanly. The best wood came from fallen trees that had dried over the summer, their bark already loose and their wood seasoned. Dried buffalo dung, which burned hot and slow, was also collected and stored. On the open prairie, where trees were scarce, buffalo chips had long been the primary fuel. Even in the river valleys, families supplemented their wood supply with dung. It was abundant, easy to gather, and burned with almost no smoke when properly dried. Women and children would go out into the surrounding area, gathering chips in baskets or bags and bringing them back to be stacked near the teepee. A large pile of dried dung, protected from snow by hides or bark, was a valuable resource. Food stores also had to be prepared. The autumn hunt, if it had been successful, would have provided large quantities of meat. Much of this meat was dried into jerky, cut into thin strips, and hung on racks to cure in the sun and wind. Properly dried meat would last for months, resistant to spoilage. It was stored in puff flesh, large, folded rawhide containers that could be sealed against moisture and pests. Pemmican, a mixture of dried meat pounded into powder, mixed with melted fat and sometimes dried berries, was prepared in large quantities. Pemmican was incredibly nutritious and could sustain a person through the hardest work. It was packed tightly into hide bags and stored inside the teepee. Roots, berries, and other plant foods gathered during the warmer months were also stored, adding variety to the winter diet. The horses, which were essential to the mobility and prosperity of the camp, required their own preparation. They were kept in sheltered areas, often in groves of cottonwood where they could strip the bark from the trees for food. Some families built simple windbreaks from brush and hides to protect their animals from the worst storms. The horses would lose condition over the winter. Their ribs would show, their coats would grow thick and shaggy, but most would survive. Losing horses to cold, starvation, or predators was a constant worry, and families checked on their animals regularly, even in harsh weather. Children's activities shifted with the season. In summer, they had ranged widely, playing games across the prairie. In winter, they stayed closer to the teepee, and their work became more focused. They helped gather firewood, cleared snow from around the dwelling, fetched water from the river by breaking through ice, and assisted with the endless small tasks that kept the household functioning. They also began to learn the stories and skills they would need as adults, spending more time listening to elders and practicing crafts by the fire. With all these preparations complete, the camp settled into the rhythm of winter. life slowed. The constant movement of the summer hunting season gave way to a more stationary existence. Families stayed close to their fires, working on crafts, repairing tools, telling stories, and waiting for the season to pass. The winter camp was not just a physical location, but a different mode of existence, a time of drawing inward, of conserving energy, and of relying on the preparations that had been made when resources were more abundant. The dew cloth was a simple innovation, but its impact on winter comfort was profound. It was essentially a second wall inside the teepee, creating a layered structure that transformed a single skin shelter into something far more effective against the cold. The cloth was suspended from the tipi poles, typically tied at a height of about 6 feet, and allowed to hang down to the ground. The top edge could be tied to the poles with thongs, or simply draped over a horizontal cord that ran around the interior of the dwelling. The bottom edge rested on the ground, often weighted down with stones or folded under sleeping robes to seal it against drafts. The result was a curtain that enclosed the lower portion of the living space, forming a cosy, insulated zone where the family spent most of their time. The gap between the dew cloth and the outer hide cover was critical. This air pocket did not circulate freely. It was a dead space, and still air is an excellent insulator. The cold from outside had to pass through the outer hide, then through this trapped layer of air, before reaching the inner surface of the dew cloth. By the time it arrived, much of its intensity had been dissipated. The inner surface of the dew cloth remained much warmer than the outer hide, which meant that the occupants sitting or lying near it did not feel the radiating cold that they would have felt against a single-layer wall. The dew cloth also managed moisture. In winter, the fire burning in the centre of the teepee produced a great deal of heat, warming the air inside to a comfortable temperature. But just outside that warmth, the hide cover was exposed to freezing temperatures. When warm, moist air from inside came into contact with the cold inner surface of the hide, condensation formed. This was inevitable. Without the dew cloth, the moisture would drip down onto the people and their belongings, soaking robes, dampening stored food, and creating a miserable, clammy environment. But the dew cloth intercepted this condensation. The moisture formed on the inner lining instead, where it would bead up and run down the surface. Because the dew cloth was slightly warmer than the outer hide, the condensation was less severe, and the moisture that did form was directed downward to the edges, where it could soak into the earth or be absorbed by materials placed there for that purpose. The living space remained dry. The dew cloth was often decorated. Since it formed the visible interior wall of the dwelling, it became a canvas for artistic expression. Geometric patterns painted in earth pigments were common. These might include triangles, zigzags, and bold bands of colour. Some families painted scenes from their lives, successful hunts, encounters with enemies, visions received in dreams. The dew cloth was owned and maintained by the woman of the household, and its decoration was a reflection of her skill and creativity. It was also a record, a visual story of the family's identity and history. The space above the dew cloth, between its top edge and the apex of the teepee, remained open. This upper zone was where the smoke gathered and flowed toward the exit. It was also where the heat from the fire rose before it could escape. The dew cloth, by sealing the lower portion of the dwelling, helped to reflect some of that rising heat back down into the living space. The fire's warmth radiated outward, struck the angled surface of the dew cloth, and was directed back toward the centre. This created a more even distribution of heat, preventing the upper portion of the tipi from becoming a heat sink that drained warmth away from the occupants below. In summer, the dew cloth was removed or rolled up and stored. It was only needed when the temperatures dropped and the condensation became an issue. But in winter, it was indispensable. It turned the teepee from a drafty, single-layer tent into a snug, double-walled home. The fire at the centre of the teepee was the heart of the dwelling. It provided heat, light, and the means to cook food. It was also a focal point for family life, a place where people gathered, talked, and worked. The fire was never allowed to go out during the winter months. Keeping it alive was a responsibility shared by everyone in the household. The fire pit was a shallow depression dug into the earth, usually circular and about 2 feet across. The dirt removed from the pit was sometimes used to create a low rim around the edges, which helped contain the coals and ashes. The pit was positioned exactly in the centre of the teepee, directly below the smoke hole at the apex. This alignment was crucial. Smoke rose vertically, and as long as the fire was centered, the smoke would rise straight up and exit through the opening above. If the fire were off-center, the smoke would hit the sloping walls of the teepee and spread throughout the interior. The fuel for the fire varied depending on what was available. In the river valleys where winter camps were established, cottonwood and willow branches were gathered and split into manageable pieces. Cottonwood burned quickly and did not produce long-lasting coals, but it was abundant and easy to gather. Willow was denser and burned more slowly. Both were acceptable for cooking and heating. On the open prairie, where trees were scarce, dried buffalo dung was the primary fuel. Buffalo chips, as they were called, were collected by the women and children during the warmer months and stored in large piles near the teepee. When dry, buffalo dung burned hot and produced very little smoke. It did not smell offensive when burned. In fact, it had almost no odour at all. The chips burned down to a fine ash that was easy to clean out of the fire pit. A well-tended fire of buffalo chips could keep a teepee warm through the night with minimal tending. The fire was built carefully. A small amount of dry grass or shredded bark was used as tinder, arranged in a loose pile at the centre of the pit. Thin twigs or small chips of dung were placed over the tinder in a cone shape, allowing air to flow through. A burning ember from the previous fire, carefully kept alive in a bed of ashes, was placed into the tinder. A gentle breath would coax it into flame. Once the tinder caught, the small twigs would ignite, and larger pieces of fuel could be added gradually. The fire was never allowed to roar. A small, steady fire was more efficient and produced less smoke. The heat from the fire radiated outward in all directions. The earth's floor absorbed some of this heat, warming slowly and retaining it for hours. The hide walls of the teepee reflected some of the heat toward the centre. The dewcloth with its angled surface directed even more heat downward into the living space. The result was a comfortable, even warmth that pervaded the lower portion of the dwelling. Cooking was done over the fire using several methods. Meat could be skewered on green sticks and roasted directly over the flames. A tripod of poles could be set up over the fire, and from it a leather bag or a clay pot could be suspended. Water could be boiled in these containers, and stews made from dried meat, roots and berries were a staple of the winter diet. Flat stones placed near the fire could be used as griddles for cooking cakes made from ground roots, or dried berries mixed with fat. The light from the fire was warm and flickering. It cast dancing shadows on the walls and illuminated the faces of the family gathered around it. In the long winter evenings, when darkness fell early and there was little to do outside, the fire became the centre of storytelling, conversation and quiet work. Women sewed and beaded by firelight. Men repaired tools and weapons. Children listened to the elders recount the history of the people, the deeds of ancestors, and the lessons of the natural world. The fire was also sacred. It was treated with respect, and there were rules governing behaviour around it. One never stepped over the fire or passed between the fire and another person, as this was considered deeply disrespectful. Offerings were sometimes made to the fire, a small bit of food, a pinch of tobacco, acknowledging its role as the life-giving centre of the home. The wind on the Great Plains was relentless. It swept across the grasslands with a force that could uproot trees and tear away anything not securely anchored. For a dwelling to survive in this environment, it had to be designed with the wind in mind. The tipi was not just tolerant of wind, it was optimized for it. The conical shape was the foundation of this stability. Wind, encountering a flat surface, exerts pressure directly against it. The force builds up, pushing and pulling, trying to dislodge the structure. But a cone presents no flat surfaces. The wind strikes the curved walls and is deflected upward and around. Instead of creating pressure, the wind slides off. This is the same principle that makes a teardrop shape efficient in water or air. The smoother and more rounded the form, the less resistance it creates. The asymmetry of the teepee enhanced this effect. The back of the dwelling, facing the prevailing westerly winds, was steeper than the front. This steeper angle meant that the wind struck the hide cover at an angle that encouraged it to flow up and over, rather than pressing directly against the structure. The result was that even in a strong wind, the tipi remained calm and stable inside, while the air rushed past outside. The hide cover itself played a crucial role. Unlike a rigid wall, the hide was flexible. When the wind pressed against it, the hide pressed more tightly against the supporting poles. This created a kind of dynamic tension. The harder the wind blew, the tighter the cover became, and the more securely it was held in place. There was no looseness, no flapping. The hide simply conformed to the framework, becoming part of the structure rather than a separate element fighting against it. The poles, too, were part of this stability. They were arranged in a circle, each leaning inward at an angle. The weight of the hide cover, combined with the tension of the wind pressing the cover against the poles, drove the base of each pole more firmly into the ground. The entire structure was self-reinforcing. As long as the poles were long enough and strong enough, and as long as they were properly lashed at the top, the Tipi could withstand winds that would flatten a tent or tear apart a poorly built cabin. The low profile of the Tipi also helped. A tall rectangular building presents a large surface area to the wind, creating a strong lever arm that can topple the structure. But the Tipi, even when it stood 20 feet tall, was only half that height at its widest point. The wind could not get under it, could not lift it. It simply hugged the ground, a streamlined form that the wind flowed over. In a severe storm, when the wind gusted and shifted direction unpredictably, the occupants could take additional measures. The base of the Tipi could be weighted down with extra stones placed around the interior perimeter. Guy lines could be attached to the poles near the top and staked out to the ground, providing extra stability. But these measures were rarely necessary. The basic design of the Tipi was so effective that it could withstand most storms without assistance. There are accounts from early travellers and traders on the Great Plains who described the violence of prairie storms and expressed amazement that the Tipis remained standing. Tents brought by European and American explorers were routinely destroyed by wind, while the Tipis around them weathered the same storms without damage. This was not luck. It was the result of centuries of observation, experimentation, and refinement. The people who built tipis understood wind in a way that outsiders did not, and they had created a dwelling that worked with the wind rather than against it. Heating a space requires energy, and the larger the space, the more energy is needed to maintain a comfortable temperature. This is a basic principle of thermodynamics, and it applied as much to a tipi on the Great Plains as it does to any dwelling. The tipi's conical form, while elegant and wind-resistant, also created a relatively small interior volume compared to a rectangular structure of similar height. This characteristic had significant practical implications for daily life, especially during the long winter months. A tipi with a base diameter of 20 feet and a height of about 15 feet enclosed a space of roughly 1,500 cubic feet. A rectangular cabin with the same floor area, 20 by 20 feet, and the same height would enclose more than twice that volume, approximately 6,000 cubic feet. The difference was substantial. Heating the tipi required far less fuel. A small fire burning in the centre could raise the temperature of the entire interior by 10 or 20 degrees, enough to keep the occupants comfortable even when the outside air was well below freezing. The same fire in a cabin would struggle to warm the space evenly, with cold corners, drafts near the floor, and heat pooling uselessly near the ceiling. The shape of the cone also meant that heat distribution was efficient. Hot air rises, and in a conical space, it rises to the apex. But the apex was not far from the living area. The distance from the fire pit to the smoke hole might be only 12 to 15 feet. The heat did not have to travel through a large distant attic or second floor before it became useful. The dew cloth, hung around the lower portion of the interior, helped reflect some of that rising heat down into the living space. The relatively short distance from fire to apex meant that even the upper portion of the dwelling contributed to the overall warmth rather than becoming a heat sink that drained energy away from the family below. The small volume also meant that the tipi could be heated quickly. When the family returned to the dwelling after a day outside in the cold, after checking on horses, gathering firewood, or fetching water, the fire could be built up, and within minutes the interior would be noticeably warmer. There was no long wait for massive log walls to absorb heat, no thick masonry to warm through. The hide walls, thin and responsive, warmed almost immediately. The air inside reached a comfortable temperature rapidly. This responsiveness made daily life more bearable and reduced the amount of fuel that needed to be burned continuously. Fuel was always a consideration. On the open prairie, wood was scarce, and even in the river valleys where winter camps were established, firewood had to be gathered daily or every few days. Cutting and hauling wood in deep snow and freezing temperatures was hard work. Axes had to be sharpened, deadfall located, branches cut and trimmed, and the wood transported back to camp. A man might spend several hours gathering enough wood for a few days. The less fuel required to keep the dwelling warm, the less labour was needed to gather it. This freed up time and energy for other essential tasks: preparing food, repairing tools and weapons, tending to the horses, maintaining the teepee itself, and socialising with neighbours. The efficiency also had implications for food. Fires used for heating could simultaneously be used for cooking, but a fire that consumed large amounts of fuel just to maintain warmth was wasteful. In the teepee, the central fire served multiple purposes without needing to be excessive. A modest fire provided heat, light for working by in the evening, and a cooking surface. The same fire in a larger space would need to be much bigger to provide equivalent warmth, consuming more fuel and creating more smoke, both problems that would reduce comfort and increase labour. The compact interior also fostered a particular quality of family life. In a large space, family members could spread out, occupying separate corners and losing the close connection that came from proximity. In the teepee, everyone was within a few feet of the fire and of each other. A person sitting on one side of the dwelling could easily speak to someone on the opposite side without raising their voice. Conversations happened naturally, without the formality of gathering from distant rooms. Children were always within sight of their parents. The work of one person was visible to all: a woman scraping a hide, a man sharpening a knife, a grandmother sewing moccasins, a child practicing with a small bow. This constant, gentle awareness of each other's presence and activities strengthened family bonds. It created a shared experience of the day, where everyone knew what everyone else was doing, what challenges they faced, and what small victories they achieved. The small volume did not mean the tipi felt cramped. The vertical height of the cone created a sense of openness overhead. Unlike a low-ceilinged room that could feel oppressive, the tipi's interior drew the eye upward, toward the cluster of poles at the apex and the circle of sky visible through the smoke hole. This vertical space gave a feeling of expansion, even as the horizontal space was modest. The circular floor plan eliminated the dead corners that made rectangular rooms feel smaller than their actual dimensions. There were no awkward spaces, no areas that were difficult to use. The entire perimeter was functional, and the central space remained open for movement. The arrangement of the interior maximised the use of available space. Sleeping areas along the walls could be rolled up during the day, freeing that space for other activities. Storage was vertical as well as horizontal. Bags and bundles hung from the poles, flesh stacked against the walls, tools suspended overhead. This three-dimensional use of space meant that a relatively small floor area could accommodate a surprising amount of belongings and still feel uncluttered. In summer, when heating was not needed, the same small volume worked in reverse. The space cooled quickly when the bottom edges of the cover were rolled up and the smoke hole was opened wide. The convection current that pulled cool air in from ground level and expelled warm air through the top was effective precisely because the volume was manageable. The air inside the teepee could be completely exchanged with outside air in a relatively short time. A larger space would have required more airflow, more adjustment, and more effort to achieve the same cooling effect. The teepee's size made it responsive to the occupants' needs, capable of rapid adjustment as conditions changed. The efficiency of the small volume was not an accident of design, but a deliberate outcome of generations of refinement. The people who built Tipis understood the relationship between space, heat, and labour. They knew that bigger was not always better, that a dwelling had to be calibrated to the realities of life on the plains: limited fuel, harsh climate, the need for mobility. The teepee's size represented a careful balance, large enough to house a family comfortably, with space for sleeping, cooking, working and storage, but small enough to be heated efficiently, cooled naturally, and transported without excessive difficulty. The teepee was not a static structure. It changed with the seasons, adjusted by the hands of the people who lived in it to meet the shifting demands of the environment. This adaptability was one of its greatest strengths. A dwelling that could be modified to suit summer heat or winter cold was far more valuable than one that worked well in only one season. In spring, as the weather began to warm and the snow melted away from the river valleys, the first adjustments were made. The earth and snow that had been banked around the base of the teepee during winter were cleared away. The dew cloth, which had provided insulation and caught condensation through the cold months, was taken down, rolled up, and stored. With the inner lining removed, the interior felt more open and airy. Light passed through the single layer of hide more easily, brightening the space. The smoke flaps, which had been carefully managed all winter to prevent downdrafts and keep snow out of the dwelling, were now adjusted for ventilation rather than protection. They were opened wider, allowing more air to flow through the smoke hole. The central fire, which had burned continuously through the winter, was allowed to go out during the warmer days, lit only in the evenings for cooking and comfort. As summer arrived and the heat intensified, the bottom edges of the teepee cover were rolled up. This was done section by section, lifting the hide and securing it with ties or by tucking it into itself. The gap created allowed cool air from ground level to flow into the dwelling, while hot air escaped through the smoke hole above. The interior became a shaded, breezy refuge from the scorching sun. On the hottest days, the family might spend much of their time outside, but the teepee remained their shelter during the worst of the afternoon heat and through the night. The orientation of the teepee, with its doorway facing east, meant that the morning sun streamed in, warming the interior after the cool night. By afternoon, when the sun was at its most intense, it was on the western side of the dwelling, and the doorway was in shade. This simple fact of alignment made a noticeable difference in comfort. In autumn, as the temperatures began to drop and the leaves of the cottonwoods turned yellow, the adjustments reversed. The bottom edges of the cover were lowered and secured. The dew cloth was brought out of storage, aired, and rehung inside the dwelling. The fire was lit and kept burning through the cooler nights. The smoke flaps were adjusted more carefully, anticipating the shifting winds of the autumn storms. When the first hard freeze came and the decision was made to move to a winter camp, the teepee was packed up and transported. Once re-erected in the sheltered valley, the full winter preparations were made, banking the base with earth or snow, ensuring the dew cloth was secure, gathering firewood, and arranging the interior for the long, cold season ahead. These adjustments were not burdensome. They were part of the rhythm of life, learned in childhood and performed without much thought. The people who lived in teepee understood their homes intimately. They knew how to read the weather, how to anticipate the needs of the dwelling, and how to make small changes that had large effects on comfort. The teepee was not a passive shelter. It was a tool, and like any tool, it required skill to use effectively. This adaptability also meant that the teepee could be used in a wide range of environments. The same basic design that worked on the northern plains, where winters were long and brutal, also worked on the southern plains, where summers were hotter and winters milder. The adjustments were different, but the principles remained the same. The teepee was a flexible solution, capable of accommodating the varied climates of the Great Plains through the simple manipulation of its components. Living in a teepee required attention. It was not a house that could be closed up and ignored. It demanded a constant, subtle engagement, an awareness of the wind, the temperature, the moisture in the air, and the behaviour of the fire. This was not a burden. It was a relationship, a daily conversation between the occupants and their dwelling. Each morning, someone in the household would step outside and assess the weather. The direction of the wind, the colour of the sky, the feel of the air, all of these informed decisions about how the teepee should be managed that day. If the wind were from the west, the smoke flaps would be adjusted to shield the opening from downdrafts. If the day promised to be hot, the bottom edges of the cover might be rolled up early. If rain were coming, the flaps would be drawn closer together. Throughout the day, small adjustments were made. The fire was tended, fed with fuel when it burned low, and allowed to die down when less heat was needed. The smoke flap poles were moved as the wind shifted. Stones along the base of the cover were repositioned if a draft was noticed. These were not large tasks. They took only moments, but they required presence, a kind of mindfulness that kept the occupants connected to their home and to the world outside it. This relationship extended to the materials of the teepee itself. The hide cover, though durable, needed care. It had to be kept clean, repaired when it tore and replaced when it wore out. The poles, though strong, could crack or split, and they had to be checked regularly. The leather thongs that lashed the poles together at the top could stretch or weaken, and they needed to be retied or replaced. The dew cloth, the fire pit, and the arrangement of the interior All of these elements required maintenance and attention. The woman of the household bore much of this responsibility. The tipi was hers. She had made the cover, or inherited it, or received it as a gift. She decided where it would be erected, how it would be arranged inside, and when it needed repair. Her skill in managing the dwelling was a source of pride and respect within the community. A well-maintained tipi, with a tight cover, no drafts, and a clean interior, reflected well on the woman who owned it. But the entire family participated in the life of the dwelling. The men gathered firewood and hauled water. The children helped with small tasks, clearing ashes from the fire pit, gathering buffalo chips, and watching for changes in the weather. The elders, with their long experience, offered advice and guidance. The tipi was a family project, and its comfort and functionality depended on everyone's contribution. This active engagement with the dwelling fostered a deep sense of connection to place, even though that place was constantly changing. The tipi was home, but home was not a location. It was a practice, a set of skills and knowledge that could be carried from one camp to the next. The family knew how to create comfort, how to stay warm in winter and cool in summer, how to manage the wind and the rain. This knowledge was portable, and it made the tipi a true home no matter where it was erected. There was also a spiritual dimension to this relationship. The tipi was not just a physical structure, it was a sacred space, and the care given to it was an expression of respect for the family, the community, and the spirits that watched over them. Maintaining the dwelling was not drudgery. It was a form of prayer, a way of honouring the life that was lived within it. This stands in contrast to the modern experience of housing, where buildings are often passive, requiring little daily interaction. Thermostats regulate temperature automatically. Walls are sealed and insulated, blocking out the weather. The occupants are separated from the environment, insulated from wind and rain and temperature swings. There is comfort in this, but there is also a kind of disconnection. The tipi demanded engagement, and in return it offered a deeper relationship, not just with the dwelling, but with the land, the weather, and the rhythms of the natural world. Every tipi doorway faced east. This orientation was consistent across the plains, practiced by the Lakota, Cheyenne, Crow, Blackfoot, and other nations. It was not a matter of convenience or random choice. The eastern orientation emerged from both practical considerations and spiritual understanding, and it shaped the daily experience of the life within the dwelling. Practically, the eastern orientation made immediate sense. The prevailing winds on the Great Plains came from the west. By placing the doorway on the opposite side, the dwelling was naturally shielded from the strongest winds. When a storm blew in, the wind pressed against the back of the tipi, driving the hide cover more tightly against the poles and making the structure more secure. The doorway, sheltered on the lee side, remained relatively calm. A person entering or leaving the tipi did not have to fight against the wind, or worry about gusts tearing the cover open. The back of the tipi took the force of the weather, while the entrance remained protected. The position of the sun also mattered. In the morning, the rising sun would shine directly through the eastern doorway, flooding the interior with light and warmth. The angle of the morning sun was low, and its rays would penetrate deep into the tipi, reaching even the back wall. This served as a natural signal for waking. As the sun rose, its light gradually filled the interior, brightening the space and warming the air. The transition from night to day was gentle but unmistakable. The family would wake to sunlight, to warmth, to the visible beginning of a new day. The morning light was soft and golden, a pleasant way to begin. It fell across the sleeping robes, illuminating the painted dewcloth, catching in the smoke rising from the rekindled fire. By mid-morning, the sun had moved higher, and its light entered the tipi at a steeper angle, no longer reaching as deeply inside. By noon, the sun was overhead, and the interior was illuminated by diffused light passing through the hide walls, rather than by direct rays through the doorway. By afternoon, when the sun was high and hot, it had moved to the western side of the dwelling. The back wall, facing west, received the full force of the afternoon sun, but the doorway was now in shade. This kept the interior cooler during the hottest part of the day. The entrance, the primary opening in the dwelling, was not admitting the intense afternoon heat. Instead, it opened onto shaded air and any breeze coming through the doorway carried coolness rather than warmth. In the evening, as the sun set in the west, it would illuminate the back wall from outside, but the interior of the teepee would already be settling into twilight. The transition from day to night was as gentle as the morning's transition from night to day. The family would gather around the fire as the light faded, and the fire would become the primary source of illumination, taking over from the sun in a natural progression. The Eastern orientation carried meaning beyond these practical benefits. The east was the direction of the rising sun, and the sun was understood as a source of life, light, and power. Its daily journey across the sky, rising in the east, climbing to its zenith, setting in the west, was a fundamental pattern of existence. To face east was to align oneself with this pattern, to acknowledge it, to participate in it. Each morning, as the family emerged from the teepee to greet the sun, they were engaging in an act of recognition. They were acknowledging the source of light and warmth, the power that caused the grass to grow, the buffalo to thrive, and life to continue. This greeting did not require a formal ceremony. It was a simple, everyday practice, stepping out of the teepee, feeling the sun on one's face, and beginning the day with awareness. A person might pause for a moment, facing east, breathing in the morning air, observing the quality of the light and the feel of the wind. This moment of stillness and attention was a form of prayer, though it might not have been described as such. It was a way of starting the day in relationship with the world rather than simply launching into tasks and labour. The 4 cardinal directions held meaning in the cosmology of many plains peoples. East was associated with birth, spring, and the morning, the beginning of cycles. South was summer, growth, and the fullness of life. West was autumn, the setting sun, and the transition toward rest and completion. North was winter, night, and the place of elders and wisdom. The teepee, by orienting itself to the east, participated in this directional symbolism. It placed the family at the centre of a sacred geography, with the directions radiating outward from their home. The dwelling became a kind of compass, a fixed reference point in the spiritual landscape even as it moved across the physical landscape. Inside the teepee, the eastern doorway influenced the organisation of the space. The place of honour, where the head of the household sat and where important guests were received, was directly opposite the doorway at the western side of the interior. This was the farthest point from the entrance, the most sheltered and respected position. The morning sun entering through the eastern door would illuminate this place first and most fully. Sacred objects, medicine bundles, and the family's most valued possessions were stored in this western area, in the place that received the blessing of the morning light. The path from the doorway to the place of honour was more than a physical route. It was a symbolic journey. From the rising sun in the east, through the living space of the family gathered around the central fire, to the seat of authority and wisdom in the west. A guest entering the teepee would walk this path, moving from outside to inside, from the threshold to the heart of the home. The journey was short, only a few steps, but it carried meaning. It was a movement, from the public world into the private sanctuary of the family, from the vast openness of the prairie into the intimate enclosure of the dwelling. The eastern doorway also served as a frame for the world outside. From inside the teepee, looking out through the doorway, a person would see the prairie stretching away to the east. In the morning they would see the sun rising over that landscape. In the evening they would see the sky darkening in that direction, the stars beginning to appear. The doorway was not just an entrance and exit, but a window, a portal through which the family remained connected to the larger world, even while sheltered within their home. The consistency of the eastern orientation across the plains meant that a person travelling from one camp to another would always find the same alignment. Every teepee they entered would have the same relationship to the sun, the same organisation of interior space, the same symbolic geography. This created a sense of familiarity and order that transcended individual dwellings. The teepee was not just this family's home, but a pattern, a shared understanding of how a home should be organised and oriented. This consistency reinforced cultural identity and created a sense of continuity across time and space. Stepping through the doorway of a teepee and into its interior was like entering a small, carefully organised world. Every object had its place, and every place had its meaning. The arrangement of the interior was not arbitrary. It was governed by customs and practices that reflected the social structure of the family and the spiritual beliefs of the people. The fire pit at the centre was the anchor point. Everything else was arranged in relation to it. Directly behind the fire, opposite the doorway, was the place of honour. This was the western side of the dwelling, the farthest point from the entrance and the most protected. The head of the household sat here. It was the warmest spot, shielded from drafts by the fire and the bodies of the family sitting around it. When a guest of importance visited, they would be invited to sit in this honoured position, a sign of respect and hospitality. This western space was also where the family's most valuable and sacred possessions were kept. Medicine bundles, collections of sacred objects wrapped in hide or cloth, were stored here, often hung from the poles or placed on a special stand. These bundles contained items of spiritual power, objects received in visions or passed down through generations. They were not to be touched carelessly or by outsiders. Their presence in the place of honour underscored the sacredness of that space. The interior was divided along a line running from the doorway to the back of the tipi. The right side, as one entered, was generally considered the domain of the man. Here he kept his weapons, bows, arrows, lances, shields, and his hunting gear. Quivers hung from the poles. A shield, often painted with protective symbols, might be propped against the wall. Tools for working leather, bone and stone were stored here, along with ceremonial items used in rituals and dances. The left side belonged to the woman. This was where she kept the tools of her work: scrapers for preparing hides, awls for sewing, bags of sinew thread, and containers of pigments for painting. Cooking utensils, wooden bowls, stone knives, bags made from buffalo stomachs for carrying water, were stored on this side. Food supplies were also kept here: bundles of dried meat, bags of dried berries, pemmican packed in hide pouches, and roots stored in woven baskets. The woman's side was the practical heart of the household, the place from which meals emerged and clothing was made. This division was not rigid or absolute. It was a general organisation, a framework that made daily life easier by ensuring that everyone knew where things were. A man might reach across to the woman's side to get a bowl of food, or a woman might handle a man's tools if she was helping with a task. But the underlying principle, that each side had its primary owner and purpose, remained understood and respected. Sleeping areas were arranged along the walls, radiating out from the fire like the spokes of a wheel. Each member of the family had their designated place. The parents typically slept on the honoured western side or near it. Children slept closer to the doorway, where they could be easily watched. Elders, if they lived with the family, occupied a place of respect near the back. The beds were simple, buffalo robes spread over a foundation of dried grass, willow branches or soft hides. During the day, the sleeping robes were rolled up and stored, freeing the space for other activities. Sitting was done on the ground, either directly on the hide floor or on additional robes spread for comfort. But the Plains peoples had also developed a clever piece of furniture, the willow backrest. This was made from a series of slender willow rods, peeled and smoothed, laced together side by side with sinew or cord. The assembled panel of rods was flexible, conforming to the curve of a person's back. It was supported by a small tripod of sticks, angled so that it leaned back at a comfortable reclining angle. A soft buffalo robe draped over the willow rods made the backrest even more comfortable. These backrests could be positioned anywhere around the fire, allowing people to sit for long periods without discomfort. The space immediately around the fire was kept clear. This was the working area, the place where cooking was done, where people moved when they needed to tend the fire or retrieve something from storage. No one left objects lying in this central zone. To do so would be to obstruct the flow of daily life and to show disrespect for the fire. The upper portion of the tipi, above the dewcloth, was largely open. Poles converged toward the apex, and from them hung various items: bags, tools, herbs drying, or strips of meat. The smoke from the fire rose through this upper space and exited through the smoke hole. On a clear day, shafts of sunlight would filter down from the opening, illuminating the smoke as it drifted upward. The effect was beautiful, a gentle play of light and shadow that changed throughout the day. The dewcloth itself often served as a canvas for decoration. Some families painted geometric designs on the inner lining: triangles, diamonds, zigzag lines in red, black, yellow and blue. Others painted representational images, buffalo, horses, birds, or scenes from hunts and battles. These paintings were not mere decoration, they were records, visual stories of the family's experiences and achievements. A particularly successful hunt might be commemorated in a painted scene. A vision received in a dream might be rendered in symbolic form. The dew cloth, seen by everyone who sat around the fire, became a living chronicle of the family's life. The dew cloth that lined the interior of the teepee during the colder months was more than insulation. It was a surface for expression, a place where the family's identity and history could be made visible. The paintings that adorned many dew cloths were not casual doodles or idle decoration. They were deliberate, meaningful works of art that carried stories, honoured achievements, and connected the family to the broader narratives of their people. The right to paint a tipi or its interior lining was not taken lightly. In many plains cultures, the designs a person could use were earned or inherited. A man might receive the right to paint a particular pattern through a vision, a spiritual experience in which the design was revealed to him along with instructions for its use. Alternatively, the right might be purchased from another person who had the authority to transfer it, or it might be passed down from father to son as part of a family's heritage. To paint a design without proper authority was considered wrong, even dangerous, as the images were believed to carry spiritual power. The subjects of these paintings varied. Geometric patterns were common and carried their own symbolism. Triangles might represent mountains or teepees. Zigzag lines could symbolize lightning, rivers, or the path of life. Circles represented the sun, the moon, or the sacred circle of existence. Bands of colour running horizontally around the dew cloth created visual rhythm and could mark different zones of meaning, earth at the bottom, sky at the top, with the human world in between. Representational images were also painted. Buffalo were a frequent subject, honouring the animal that sustained the people. A buffalo painted on the dew cloth might be shown in profile, with careful attention to the curve of its back, the shape of its horns, and the texture of its shaggy coat. Horses which had transformed plains life were also depicted, often shown in motion, running or carrying a rider. Birds, especially eagles and hawks, appeared as symbols of spiritual power and vision. These were not naturalistic portraits, but stylized representations, capturing the essential character of the animal in a few bold lines and shapes. Some families painted scenes of specific events. A successful hunt might be shown, with hunters surrounding a buffalo or driving a herd toward a cliff. A battle, if it had been particularly significant or honourable, might be commemorated with figures on horseback wielding lances and shields. These scenes were narratives, stories told in images. Guests visiting the teepee could read the dew cloth, understanding the family's history and accomplishments from the painted record. The work of painting was usually done by men, though women sometimes participated, especially in preparing the pigments and assisting with the application. The pigments themselves were made from natural materials: earth, minerals, charcoal and plant extracts. Red came from iron-rich clay, yellow from certain clays and lichens, black from charcoal or burned bone, white from crushed gypsum or certain clays. Blue was more difficult to obtain, sometimes made from certain clays or later acquired through trade. These pigments were ground into fine powder, mixed with water or fat to create a paint, and applied to the hide with brushes made from buffalo hair, frayed sticks, or bone tools. The painting was done carefully, often over several days. The dew cloth was laid out flat, and the design was sketched lightly in charcoal or scratched into the surface with a sharp tool. Then the colours were filled in, starting with the largest areas and working toward the details. The painter worked with concentration and intention, knowing that the images being created were not just art but a form of prayer, a way of honouring the spirits in the events depicted. Once painted, the dew cloth was treated with reverence. It was not allowed to touch the ground carelessly or be handled roughly. When the cloth was hung inside the teepee, the painted images faced inward, visible to the family and their guests. The firelight at night would animate the images, making them flicker and seem to move in the dancing shadows. Sitting around the fire, the family was surrounded by their own story, their own identity rendered in colour and form. The painted dew cloth also served a social function. It announced the family's status and accomplishments to visitors. A tipi with elaborate, well-executed paintings was a source of pride. It showed that the family had the resources, the skill, and the spiritual authority to create such work. In a culture where individual reputation and family honour were deeply important, the painted dew cloth was a public statement, visible evidence of a life well lived. The tipi was not simply a practical structure. It was a physical manifestation of cosmology, a dwelling that embodied the spiritual beliefs and worldview of the people who built it. To live in a tipi was to live inside a symbol, surrounded by reminders of the connections between earth, sky, and spirit. The floor of the tipi represented the earth. It was the foundation, the place where life took root. The earth was understood as a living being, a mother who provided everything needed for survival. Grass for the buffalo, water in the rivers, clay for pots, and the hides and poles from which the tipi itself was made. To sit on the floor of the tipi was to be in direct contact with this source of life. There were no raised platforms, no separation from the ground. The family lived close to the earth, and this closeness was both practical and sacred. The hide walls of the tipi, curving upward and inward to form the cone, represented the sky. The sky was the great dome that covered the world, the realm of the sun, moon, and stars. It was the source of rain, wind, and weather. The sky was also home to the spirits, the powers that governed the natural world and watched over the people. By enclosing the family within a structure whose walls symbolized the sky, the tipi created a space where the earthly and the celestial were brought together. The poles that formed the skeleton of the tipi were the pathways that connected earth and sky. Each pole rose from the ground, driven into the earth at its base, and reached upward toward the apex where all the poles converged. This convergence point, at the very top of the tipi, was understood as the place where the earthly and the spiritual met. It was the connection to the Great Spirit, the source of all life and power. The smoke from the central fire, rising through this opening, carried the prayers and thoughts of the family upward, delivering them to the spirits above. In some traditions, each pole was associated with a particular virtue or teaching. One pole might represent bravery, another generosity, another wisdom. The poles stood as reminders of how a person should live, the qualities that were valued and honoured. To look up at the cluster of poles at the apex was to see not just a structural necessity, but a map of right living, a guide to the moral and spiritual life. The circular floor plan of the tipi reinforced these spiritual themes. The circle is a powerful symbol in many indigenous cultures. It represents wholeness, unity, and the cyclical nature of existence. There is no beginning and no end to a circle, just as there is no beginning and no end to the cycle of life, death, and rebirth. The seasons turn in a circle: spring, summer, autumn, winter, and back to spring again. The sun and the moon are circles. The horizon, when viewed from the open prairie, is a circle. To live within a circular space was to live in harmony with these fundamental patterns of existence. The circle also fostered a sense of equality. In a rectangular room, there are corners and edges, places that are inherently more or less prominent. A circle has no such distinctions. Every point along the circumference is equidistant from the centre. While the tipi did have designated places of honour and specific zones for different activities, the underlying shape created a sense of shared space, a communal wholeness that included everyone gathered around the fire. The fire itself, burning at the centre of this sacred geometry, was more than a source of heat and light. It was a living presence, a symbol of the sun brought down to earth. The fire was fed, tended and honoured. It was never allowed to go out carelessly. Offerings might be placed into the flames, a bit of meat, a pinch of tobacco, acknowledging its role as the heart of the home and the intermediary between the physical and spiritual worlds. The tipi, then, was a temple as much as it was a house. To enter it was to step into a space that was organised around spiritual principles. The floor, walls, poles and fire were not just functional elements. They were sacred, each contributing to the creation of a dwelling that connected the family to the cosmos. Some tipis were more than homes. They were sacred structures painted with designs that had been revealed in visions or dreams, and they were understood to carry protective power. These painted tipis were relatively rare, and the right to create one was not something a person could simply decide to do. It had to be earned or granted through spiritual experience. A man might go on a vision quest, seeking guidance and connection with the spirit world. This involved fasting, solitude, and often physical hardship, climbing to a remote hilltop or enduring the elements without shelter for several days. In this state of spiritual openness, weakened by hunger and exposure, he might receive a vision. The vision could take many forms: an encounter with an animal, a voice speaking from the wind, a dream that felt more vivid and significant than waking life. Within the vision, specific instructions might be given. Paint your teepee with these images, in these colours, following this pattern, and you will receive protection in battle, success in hunting, or safety for your family. The images revealed in visions were often animals: bears, eagles, buffalo, wolves, or elk. These beings held particular significance in plain spirituality. A man who received a vision of a bear might paint bears on his teepee, positioned in specific ways according to the instructions received. The bear represented strength, healing, and ferocity in battle. An eagle represented connection to the sky, far-seeing vision, and spiritual power. A buffalo represented abundance, endurance, and the source of life itself. The animals might be painted in realistic detail or rendered symbolically, with exaggerated features or surrounded by abstract designs that represented lightning, stars, or other spiritual forces. Stars, the sun, the moon, and lightning bolts were also common elements in painted teepees. These celestial and atmospheric phenomena were understood as manifestations of spiritual power. Lightning, in particular, was associated with sudden overwhelming force and with visions. Many vision quests were conducted during thunderstorms, and the experience of lightning was sometimes part of the revelation received. A teepee painted with lightning symbols announced that its owner had received power from the storm. The process of painting a dream teepee was undertaken with great care. The vision might specify not only what was to be painted, but how, the exact colours to be used, the placement of each image on the hide cover, even the order in which the elements should be applied. To deviate from these instructions was believed to risk losing the protection the design was meant to provide, or worse, to invite misfortune. The painting was not done casually. It was often accompanied by prayers, songs specific to the vision, and offerings made to the spirits who had granted the design. The pigments for painting were prepared with attention. Red came from iron-rich clay, collected from specifics, locations known for their quality. Yellow came from certain clays and lichens, black from charcoal or burned bone, white from crushed gypsum or certain clays. Blue, the most difficult to obtain, came from specific clays or was sometimes acquired through trade with people who had access to sources farther west. These pigments were ground into fine powder using stone tools, mixed with water or animal fat to create a paint that would adhere to the hide, and applied with brushes made from buffalo hair or frayed sticks. The painting was done on the exterior of the teepee cover, often while the cover was still on the ground before being raised onto the poles. The painter worked methodically, sometimes over several days. The design was often sketched first in charcoal, light lines marking where each element would be placed. Then the colours were filled in, starting with the largest areas and working toward the finer details. The painter worked with concentration and intention, aware that the images being created were not merely decorative but carried spiritual significance and power. Once completed, the painted teepee became a sacred object. It was not just the family's dwelling but a source of strength and protection. Other members of the community would recognize the teepee by its distinctive design, visible from a distance across the prairie. The painted images served as identification. A person approaching the camp would know who lived in that particular teepee before they arrived. This recognition carried weight. A painted teepee announced that its owner had received spiritual power, that he had undergone the ordeal of a vision quest and had been granted sacred knowledge. The right to paint a particular design could also be transferred. A man who had received a vision and painted his teepee might, later in life, decide to pass that right to another person, often a younger relative or a respected member of the community. This transfer was not a casual gift. It often involved a formal ceremony, and the recipient might be expected to provide gifts in exchange: horses, hides, weapons, or other valuables. The exchange recognized the value of the sacred knowledge being transferred. The original owner would teach the new owner the exact details of the painting, describing the placement of each element, the specific shades of colour to be used, and the songs or prayers associated with the design. This instruction ensured that the sacred knowledge was preserved accurately. Painted tipis were sometimes associated with specific warrior societies within a tribe. These societies were organisations of men who had achieved particular status through their actions, in battle or through spiritual experiences. A man who belonged to a particular society might paint his tipi with the symbols of that group, marking his affiliation. The design served as a public announcement of his identity and his standing within the community. These society tipis would often be grouped in the camp, creating a visible cluster that reinforced the social structure. The presence of painted tipis in a camp added layers of meaning to the physical landscape. An ordinary camp of plain tipis was simply a collection of dwellings. A camp that included painted tipis became something more, a gathering that included visible manifestations of spiritual power, structures that carried protection and meaning beyond their practical function. The painted tipis were focal points, markers of significance within the community. There are accounts from the historical period of families refusing to camp immediately adjacent to certain painted tipis, particularly those associated with war power or with visions that involved dangerous spirits. The respect for these dwellings included a kind of caution, an awareness that powerful forces were present and should not be approached carelessly. Conversely, being invited to enter a painted tipi was a significant honour. It indicated trust, respect and recognition of the guest's own standing. Inside such a tipi, the atmosphere was understood to be different, more formal, more charged with significance. Not all tipis were painted with sacred designs. The vast majority were plain on the exterior, or decorated only with simple personal designs on the interior dewcloth. But the existence of the painted sacred tipis added dimension to the entire tradition. They demonstrated that the tipi was more than a utilitarian shelter. It could be a vessel for spiritual power, a physical manifestation of visions received, a connection to forces beyond the visible world. The painted tipis stood as evidence that the dwelling served not only the body but also the spirit, and that these two aspects of existence were not separate but interwoven in daily life. To live in a tipi was to live in a space where order and meaning pervaded every detail. Nothing was random. Every object had its place, every action its proper form, and every element of the dwelling contributed to a sense of harmony and balance. This was not the result of rigid rules imposed from outside, but the natural expression of a worldview that saw the universe as an ordered, interconnected whole. The arrangement of the interior, as we have seen, followed a clear pattern. The fire at the centre, the place of honour at the back, the division of space between male and female domains, the sleeping areas along the walls, all of these created a geography that made sense to everyone who lived within it. A child growing up in a tipi learned this geography without formal instruction. It was simply the way things were, absorbed through daily experience. But the order extended beyond physical arrangement. There were social and spiritual protocols that governed behaviour inside the tipi. One did not walk between another person and the fire, as this blocked the warmth and light and showed disrespect. One did not step over another person's legs or belongings. When entering the tipi, a guest would pause at the doorway and wait to be invited in, rather than barging through uninvited. Once inside, the guest would move to the left or right, depending on their gender and status, and would take a seat where directed by the host. Conversation around the fire followed its own patterns. Elders spoke, and younger people listened. Stories were told in a certain way, with proper attention to detail and sequence. Decisions affecting the family were discussed openly, with each person's input considered. The fire, as the centre of this activity, seemed to mediate the conversation, its light and warmth creating a space where speech flowed naturally. Even the way objects were stored reflected this sense of order. Weapons hung from the poles or rested against the walls in designated spots. Food bags were hung from pegs to keep them off the ground and away from insects or rodents. Tools were kept in specific containers or bundles so they could be found quickly when needed. Nothing was left in disarray. A tipi that was cluttered or chaotic was seen as a sign of poor management, a failure to uphold the standards that made life comfortable and meaningful. This order was not oppressive, it was liberating. When everything had its place, the mind was free to focus on more important things: relationships, creativity, spiritual practice, the enjoyment of food and story and song. There was no time wasted searching for misplaced objects, no frustration with disorganization. The Tipi, in its ordered simplicity, created a foundation for a rich and fulfilling life. The circular form of the dwelling reinforced this sense of harmony. A circle is inherently balanced, with no angles or edges to create tension. The eye, looking around the interior, found no jarring contrasts, no uncomfortable corners. The gaze could move smoothly from one side to the other, taking in the whole space without interruption. This visual harmony contributed to a feeling of peace, a sense that all was as it should be. The Tipi was also a reminder that order exists at every scale. The small personal order of the family dwelling mirrored the larger order of the universe, the cycles of day and night, the turning of the seasons, the movements of the stars. To maintain order in one's home was to participate in the maintenance of cosmic order, to do one's small part in keeping the world balanced and functioning. This worldview stands in contrast to the modern tendency to see order as something imposed artificially, a set of rules that constrain freedom. In the Tipi, order was natural and necessary. It flowed from the structure of the dwelling itself, from the relationships between family members, and from the spiritual principles that governed life. It was not a burden, but a gift, a framework within which human flourishing became possible. The long winter evenings, when darkness fell early and the world outside was cold and still, were times for stories. The family gathered around the central fire, seated on their buffalo robes with backrests supporting them, and the elders spoke. They told the history of the people, the deeds of ancestors, the lessons learned from animals and from the land. The firelight flickered on the walls of the teepee, and the smoke rose gently toward the apex, carrying with it the words and the wisdom of generations. Storytelling was not entertainment in the modern sense, it was education. It was the way knowledge was preserved and transmitted from one generation to the next. There were no written records, no books or documents. Everything important had to be remembered and spoken aloud. The stories encoded practical knowledge, where the buffalo could be found in different seasons, how to read the weather, which plants were good for medicine, and how to track game across different terrain. But they also carried moral teachings, explanations of how the world came to be, and reminders of how one should live. Some stories were about the creation of the world and the origins of the people. These were sacred narratives told with care and reverence. They explained why things were the way they were, why the buffalo had a hump, why the stars followed their patterns across the sky, why certain places on the land were holy. These stories connected the listeners to the deep past, to a time before memory when the world was young, and the spirits walked openly among the people. Other stories were about tricksters and clever animals. Coyote was a frequent character in these tales, sometimes foolish, sometimes wise, always unpredictable. These stories taught through example and counter-example. They showed the consequences of greed, dishonesty, or arrogance, but they did so with humour rather than stern moralising. The listeners laughed at Coyote's mistakes and felt the sting of recognition when they saw their own flaws reflected in his antics. There were also personal stories, accounts of things that had happened within living memory. A grandfather might tell of a great hunt when he was young, describing the skill required to approach a herd of buffalo without being detected, the tension of the moment before the chase began, and the coordinated effort of the hunters working together. A grandmother might tell of travelling to a distant camp for a gathering, of the people she met, the dances and ceremonies she witnessed, and the friendships that were formed. These personal stories were not boastful. They were offered as examples, as ways of showing how challenges were met and difficulties overcome. They reinforced values, courage, generosity, patience, respect. They reminded the younger listeners that they were part of a continuum, that they carried the legacy of those who came before and bore responsibility for those who would come after. The children listened quietly, absorbing the stories without interruption. Questions might be asked afterward, but during the telling, attention was expected. The stories were repeated year after year, so the children heard them many times. With each retelling, they noticed new details, understood new layers of meaning. By the time they were adults, they had internalized these narratives so thoroughly that they could tell the stories themselves, passing them on to the next generation. The fire itself was part of the storytelling. The dancing flames created shadows that moved across the walls, animating the painted images on the dewcloth. The warmth of the fire was comforting, a physical anchor that kept the listeners relaxed and attentive. The sound of the fire, the occasional pop of burning wood, the soft crackle of flame provided a gentle background, a rhythm that supported the cadence of the storyteller's voice. Sometimes the stories were accompanied by songs. The melody would be simple, easy to remember, and the words would reinforce the story's message. The entire family might join in, their voices blending in the enclosed space of the tipi. The sound would rise with the smoke, filling the dwelling and then escaping into the night sky. These evenings were times of closeness, when the bonds of family were strengthened and the sense of belonging to something larger than oneself was reinforced. The tipi, as the physical space that held these gatherings, became more than a shelter. It was the container for memory, for culture, for the ongoing life of the people. The stories told within its walls were woven into the fabric of the dwelling itself, so that the tipi became inseparable from the narratives it had witnessed. The tipi held within itself a paradox that never needed to be resolved. It was at the same time an entirely practical dwelling and a sacred space. These two aspects were not in conflict. They were inseparable, two facets of a single reality. The tipi sheltered the body and nourished the spirit, and it did both without compromise. As a practical dwelling, the tipi excelled. It kept a family warm in winter, cool in summer, and dry in rain. It could be dismantled and moved in less than an hour, allowing the people to follow the bison herds across vast distances. It required no nails, no metal tools, no complex joinery. It was built entirely from materials provided by the land and the animals: buffalo hides, lodgepole pines, sinew, leather thongs. It was efficient to heat, resistant to wind, and adaptable to changing conditions. From a purely functional standpoint, it was a masterpiece of design. But the tipi was never just a machine for living. From the moment the first pole was raised, the dwelling was imbued with meaning. The circular floor plan echoed the sacred circle of existence. The poles reaching toward the sky were pathways to the spirit world. The fire at the centre was a living symbol of the sun. The eastern doorway aligned the family with the rising sun and the principle of renewal. Every element of the structure served a practical purpose and carried symbolic weight. This integration of the practical and the sacred reflected a worldview that did not separate the two. In the culture of the Plains peoples, there was no divide between the material and the spiritual. The buffalo that provided the hide for the tipi was not just a resource, it was a sacred being, honoured and thanked for its sacrifice. The act of preparing the hides, stitching them together, and raising the cover was not just labour, it was a form of prayer. The daily tasks of tending the fire, adjusting the smoke flaps, and maintaining the dwelling were not chores, they were ways of participating in the sacred order of the world. The tipi, then, was a temple because it was a home, and it was a home because it was a temple. To live within it was to dwell in a space where every action had resonance, where the ordinary and the extraordinary were woven together. Cooking a meal, telling a story, sleeping beneath the buffalo robes, all of these were both mundane and sacred, both necessary and meaningful. This stands in contrast to the modern experience, where the sacred is often confined to specific places and times, churches, temples, ceremonies, while the rest of life is considered secular. The tipi made no such distinction. The sacred pervaded every moment, and the home itself was the primary temple, the place where the family encountered the divine in their daily existence. The tipi also embodied a particular relationship with the land. It was not a permanent structure that altered the landscape or claimed it as property. When a camp moved on, the grass would spring back, the earth would show no scar, and the land would return to its natural state. The tipi left no trace. This was not because the people were primitive or could not build permanent structures. It was because they understood their relationship with the land differently. They were not conquerors or owners. They were participants, partners in a living ecosystem. The tipi allowed them to live on the land without dominating it, to be part of the prairie rather than imposed upon it. In this way, the tipi was also a statement of humility. It acknowledged that human life was not separate from or superior to the natural world. The people depended on the buffalo, the grass, the water, the wind. The tipi, built from these elements and designed to work with them rather than against them, was an expression of this dependence and this respect. To ask why the Plains peoples built Tipis instead of permanent houses is to ask the wrong question. It assumes that permanence is a virtue, that a fixed structure rooted to one location is inherently superior to a dwelling that can be moved. But for the nomadic peoples of the Great Plains, permanence was not found in buildings. It was found in relationships, in practices, in knowledge, and in the continuity of culture. The Tipi was permanent in all the ways that mattered. It was a design that had been refined over generations, tested and perfected through countless iterations. The knowledge of how to build it, how to use it, how to maintain it, this knowledge was permanent, carried in the minds and hands of the people, and passed down from parents to children. The tipi could be erected anywhere, and when it was, it became home. The structure might be new, the location different, but the experience of home remained constant. A permanent house, on the other hand, ties its occupants to a single place. This makes sense in a world where resources are stationary, fields that can be planted, forests that provide timber, quarries that yield stone. But on the Great Plains, the primary resource was the buffalo, and the buffalo moved. To build a permanent house on the prairie would have been to choose starvation. The house might stand for decades, solid and unchanging, but its occupants would have had to leave it behind, following the herds or perishing. The teepee, then, was not a compromise or a second-best option. It was the only option that made sense. It was a dwelling perfectly adapted to its environment and to the way of life that environment demanded. It was portable because the people needed to be mobile. It was efficient because resources were precious. It was durable because it had to withstand harsh conditions. And it was beautiful because beauty and function were not opposites in the worldview of the people who made it. There is also a deeper question about what it means to be rooted. A permanent house roots a family to a place, but the teepee roots a family to a practice. The act of raising the teepee, arranging the interior, tending the fire, adjusting the smoke flaps, these were rituals, repeated in every camp that created a sense of continuity and belonging. The family was at home not because they were in a particular location, but because they were engaged in familiar practices, surrounded by familiar objects, and connected in familiar ways. This kind of rootedness is portable. It travels with the people. It does not depend on the land beneath the dwelling, but on the knowledge and relationships within it. A family could move 100 miles, raise their teepee in a new camp, and be home within hours. The landscape outside might be different, but the landscape inside, the arrangement of the fire, the placement of the beds, the division of space, the presence of family was the same. In this sense, the teepee was more permanent than any fixed structure. Houses decay. They burn, collapse, and are reclaimed by nature. But the knowledge of how to build a teepee, the skills required to live in one, the cultural practices that made it a home, these could not be destroyed by fire or flood. They persisted as long as the people persisted, carried forward through generations, adapting when necessary but remaining fundamentally intact. The tipi also embodied a different relationship with time. A permanent house is an investment in the future, a statement that this place will be occupied for years or decades to come. But the tipi lived in the present. It was built for now, for this season, for this camp. When the camp moved, the tipi moved with it. There was no investment in permanence because permanence was not the goal. The goal was to live well in the present, to meet the needs of the family now, and to trust that the future would be met with the same skills and knowledge that had always served the people. This is not to romanticize the hardships of nomadic life. It was difficult, demanding, and often dangerous. But the tipi made it possible. It was the tool that allowed the people to thrive in an environment that would have been uninhabitable without it. And in doing so, it became more than a tool. It became a symbol of a way of life, a philosophy of dwelling, and a relationship with the land that was both humble and profound. The tipi, as a dwelling and as a concept, offers lessons that extend far beyond the history of the Great Plains. It is a case study in adaptation, in the intelligent use of materials, in the integration of form and function, and in the possibility of living lightly upon the earth. These lessons remain relevant, perhaps more so now than at any time since the tipi was the primary dwelling of the Plains peoples. First, there is the lesson of adaptation. The tipi was not designed in isolation or imposed upon the environment. It emerged from a deep understanding of the land, the climate, the available resources, and the needs of the people. Every aspect of its design was a response to specific conditions. The conical shape addressed the wind. The translucent hides addressed the need for light and insulation. The smoke flaps addressed ventilation. The portability addressed the nomadic lifestyle. The Tipi succeeded because it was perfectly suited to its context. It did not try to impose a foreign idea of what a house should be. It asked what a dwelling needed to be in this place for these people, and it answered that question brilliantly. Second, there is the lesson of efficiency. The Tipi achieved maximum shelter with minimal materials and labour. A single buffalo hide, properly prepared, served multiple functions: protection from weather, insulation, and light filtration. The poles, simple and unprocessed beyond peeling and smoothing, provided a strong framework. There was no waste, no excess. Everything served a purpose, and nothing unnecessary was included. This efficiency extended to the use of energy. The small interior volume meant that a modest fire could heat the entire dwelling. The natural ventilation system required no pumps or fans. The design worked with natural forces rather than fighting against them. Third, there is the lesson of sustainability. The Tipi was built entirely from renewable resources, animal hides and wooden poles. When a hide wore out, it was replaced. When a pole broke, a new one was cut. The materials came from the land, and when the dwelling was finally abandoned, those materials returned to the land, biodegrading completely and leaving no permanent trace. The Tipi did not depend on extraction industries, on fossil fuels, on complex supply chains. It was a truly local, truly sustainable dwelling. Fourth, there is the lesson of flexibility. The Tipi could be adjusted to meet changing conditions. In summer, it was opened up for cooling. In winter, it was sealed and insulated. The smoke flaps could be moved to address shifting winds. The interior could be rearranged as needs changed. This adaptability meant that a single dwelling could serve a family year-round, in a wide range of climates and conditions. It did not require different structures for different seasons or different versions for different locations. It was a universal solution, capable of local adaptation. Fifth, there is the lesson of integration. The Tipi did not separate practical function from spiritual meaning, work from ritual, the mundane from the sacred. It held all of these together in a single, coherent structure. This integration created a dwelling that nourished both body and spirit, that made daily life meaningful and elevated the ordinary into the realm of the sacred. In a world that increasingly fragments existence into disconnected categories, work, home, recreation, spirituality, the Tipi stands as a reminder that wholeness is possible. Finally, there is the lesson of humility. The Tipi did not dominate the landscape. It did not announce itself as a monument or a fortress. It was a modest, temporary structure that fit into the prairie without overwhelming it. When the people moved on, the land healed, and the Tipi's presence became a memory rather than a scar. This relationship with the land, respectful, light, and impermanent, is a profound alternative to the modern impulse to build structures that last forever, regardless of their environmental cost. These lessons do not suggest that everyone should live in tipis, or that modern housing is inherently wrong. But they do suggest that there are principles embedded in the tipi's design that are worth remembering. Adaptation to local conditions, efficiency in use of resources, sustainability, flexibility, integration of function and meaning, and humility in relation to the land. These principles can inform contemporary architecture and contemporary life, offering a path toward dwellings that are both more sustainable and more meaningful. The tipi stands now as a symbol, often misunderstood, sometimes romanticized, but always powerful. It was never a primitive tent, never a compromise, never a lesser form of shelter. It was a sophisticated, elegant, and deeply meaningful dwelling, perfectly suited to the life and landscape of the Great Plains. It kept families warm through brutal winters and cool through searing summers. It could be packed and moved in less than an hour, allowing the people to follow the buffalo herds that sustained them. It was built from the very animals and plants that the land provided, and it returned to the land without a trace when its time was done. But the tipi was more than a shelter. It was a home in the fullest sense, a place of family, of warmth, of story and song. It was a sacred space, where the earthly and the spiritual met, where the fire connected the occupants to the sun, and where the poles reached upward toward the Great Spirit. It was a circle, mirroring the cycles of life and the sacred geometry of existence. It was a work of art, often painted with images that told the family's story and honoured their visions. The question of why the Plains peoples built tipis instead of permanent houses reveals a misunderstanding. The tipi was not instead of a house. It was a house, and it was permanent in all the ways that mattered. Its permanence was in its design, in the knowledge required to build and use it, in the cultural practices that made it a home, and in the continuity it provided across generations and across the vast distances of the prairie. To understand the tipi is to understand a way of life that valued motion over stasis, relationship over possession, and harmony with the land over dominance of it. It is to see that home is not necessarily a fixed location, but can be a practice, a set of skills, a web of relationships. It is to recognise that simplicity and sophistication are not opposites, that a dwelling can be both modest and magnificent. The world that gave rise to the tipi has largely passed. The great buffalo herds are gone. The nomadic life of the Plains peoples was disrupted and then destroyed by forces beyond their control. But the tipi remains, not just as a historical artefact, but as an enduring symbol of ingenuity, resilience, and a profound understanding of how to live well in a challenging world. Its lessons are still there, waiting quietly, like the prairie grass bending in the wind, for those who choose to listen. Rest now. Let the images of that vast grassland, that conical home, that warm fire settle into your thoughts. The tipi has done its work, sheltering not just bodies but also the knowledge of what it means to dwell wisely upon the earth. Sleep well,